Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of New York City Builds Bio Plus. I'm Mitch Simpler, a partner at Jarris Baum & Bowles Consulting Engineer, as well as one of the founders of New York City Builds Bio Plus. Tonight's episode is a change of pace from our normal breakfast meetings and symposia fare. Tonight is intended to be a virtual networking reception for our current members, as well as to provide an opportunity for prospective members of New York City Builds Bio Plus to get to meet some of the current members, as well as to get a taste of the depth and the breadth of the technical material that is typically presented to the membership on a regular basis. I've said this many times before to most of you, and I meant it then just as much as I mean it now. 3 years ago, when Nancy Kelly and I discussed the need for a group of like-minded individuals, such as New York City Builds Bio Plus, to pull together a diverse group of individuals to form an industry group whose sole purpose was to bridge the knowledge and communication gaps between the New York real estate community, the research and life science community, the brokerage community, and finally the professional design community. Who knew then that it would have become the success that it is today? Even in these most challenging of times, our last quarterly breakfast was incredibly well attended, as is tonight's reception with over 200 people registered to participate. So it is truly my privilege and honor to welcome all of you who are already members back to tonight's New York City Builds Bio Plus networking reception. And for those prospective members who are visiting for the first time, just welcome, period. I would be remiss if I did not thank our founding as well as sustaining corporate member firms, which include Jarris Baum & Bowles, Fried Frank, Hunter Roberts, Sabi Corporation, and Nancy J. Kelly and Associates. And a special thanks to tonight's event sponsor, Simone Healthcare Development. It is now my pleasure to introduce the MC for tonight's event, our very own New York City Builds Bio Plus Executive Director, Miss Nancy J. Kelly. Nancy, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Mitch, and hello, everyone. Welcome to NYC Builds Bio virtually reception for members and prospective members in collaboration with BioCentury. If we were all together tonight, we would be enjoying some good food and libations. So I encourage all of you to have a cocktail and grab your favorite snack of choice. And I just thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm grateful that we could all be together during this really unsettling time to share our experiences as we come together as a community. And we have come together. We saw that last week at the quarterly breakfast in heroic ways to take care of New York City and each other. The resilience our community has shown is impressive, and I'm confident that we will come through this crisis stronger despite the difficulty and uncertainty we're facing today. So we've got a very exciting lineup of speakers on important topics tonight, and we'll enjoy a virtual tour of InnoLabs, the life science property that's being developed by King Street Properties in Long Island City. I also want to thank our sponsor, Simone Healthcare Development, and acknowledge the founding and corporate members without whom we couldn't make this program possible. This is the third of 4 virtual events hosted by NYC Builds Bio this month. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out and register for these programs on the website. Last week, we hosted our first virtually quarterly breakfast attended by over 100 registrants, which focused on the heroic efforts made by companies and institutions and many of NYC Builds Bio members to produce and expand the testing capacity, personal protective equipment, and facilities needed to care for patients during the recent COVID-19 crisis. On May 19th, in collaboration with Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, we hosted a webinar entitled Vanquishing the Virus, which provided an in-depth look at the vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 under development. We heard from Alex Philippidis, Senior News Editor at Gen, and the executives from 3 New York companies and institutions that are actively working on vanquishing the virus: Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, Tonix Pharmaceuticals, and Mount Sinai Innovation Partners. You can access the event presentation and recording for both of these events on the events page on the website. And on May 28th, SGA will host the first program of our newly launched virtual seminar series, also in collaboration with Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, entitled Life Science Facility Planning Post-COVID-19. Before I begin, I just want to highlight a few administrative details. There's a program and a PowerPoint highlighting the sponsors, speakers, and projects for this meeting. They will be posted on the NYC Builds Bio website afterwards. The program's being recorded and will be available on the website as well and on the YouTube channel. If anyone's having technical difficulties accessing the Zoom room or other technical issues, please email info@nycbuildsbio.org or send a notice through the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat button. We will open up for discussion and Q&A at the end of the program, and will address as many questions as we possibly can. And at the end of the meeting, we will have a chance for smaller randomized groups to meet in separate rooms where you can open your video and microphones to talk to each other. And you can stay as long as you like and get to know each other and share each other's stories. But since this is a virtual reception for members and prospective members, before we begin the program, I want to tell you a little bit about NYC Builds Bio and invite you to become a part of our growing community dedicated to building a strong life science cluster in New York City and beyond. Next slide. So as Mitch said, previous slide, please. As Mitch said, we basically got together 2 years ago and talked about the need to connect commercial life science opportunities in New York City to the real estate community through events, research, reports, and educational programs. Our goal was to really educate the real estate professionals about what life science means, what it could mean for employment in the city, what are the technical requirements for hosting this kind of industry in the city, and to really jumpstart a life science cluster. Next slide. So we are looking to identify and promote areas in life science development. We're looking to increase knowledge and awareness of life science clusters in New York City and beyond. We want people to start thinking about how we can retrofit office space in New York and develop new space here. We want to build a collaborative community between life sciences, design, and real estate professionals, support public policies, hold workshops and meetings, all of the things we've been doing for the last year and a half. Next slide. So our mission is to build a life science cluster that is competitive with San Francisco and Boston, who are the two leading clusters in the country at the moment. Next slide. And members have a host of benefits. They get reduced entrance to all of our events. There are networking events like tonight where they can come together and learn from each other about what's going on in the industry. We have quarterly meetings highlighting prominent life science projects throughout the city, and also prominent industry speakers. We have just finished putting together a white paper with the Building Congress, which will be published in July when they launch it. We have been publishing monthly or quarterly electronic communications and quarterly newsletters. And each year we have hosted an annual Life Science Real Estate Symposium, which is our flagship meeting. And that has been attracting between 300 and 350 professionals on both the life science and on the real estate sides. Next slide. Our members really run the gamut, from real estate companies to life science companies, institutions, service providers, investors, and public agencies. Next slide. And you can learn more about that on the website. We've also created 8 leadership committees. We have 70 participants on these committees, and all of them have been meeting at least quarterly, some of them monthly, to organize different activities in the industry throughout the city. Next slide. So to date, we have 80 members, 26 of them corporate members and 55 individual members. We've held 2 symposiums. Both have been sold out and attracted between 300 and 350 attendees. We've had 4 sold out quarterly breakfasts, and as Mitch said, we had a virtual breakfast last week, which was very successful. 2 sold out membership receptions, and tonight we're holding a virtual reception. 7 committees or 8 committees and 70 leadership participants, and the annual white paper to be published soon. Next slide, please. And we've been highlighting as life science activity has increased throughout the city. And just as in the major clusters like Boston and San Francisco, it's developing in subclusters throughout the city, which will eventually be linked. And we've been talking about those subclusters in our symposiums, and we've been following them in our publications. Next slide. We're happy to announce 2 new partnerships with BioCentury tonight, hosting this virtual membership reception. We hope to be creating more content with them in future meetings. And Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, both of these publications have a national reach. And so at the Vanquishing the Virus webinar the other day, we had 275 registrants from around the world, which was actually quite exciting. Next slide. These are the May virtual events. I encourage you to sign up for our sponsored seminar series next week. And we will be holding at least 2 virtual events a month now through the end of the year. In June, we will be partnering with EisnerAmper to talk to many of the investment bankers, venture capitalists, and commercial bankers that are financing the life science companies and get their opinions on where the industry will go post-COVID-19. And we will then be partnering with Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News once again to take a look at the 10 life science clusters below the top 2, which includes New York. And we will be looking at those and talking to people active in those clusters throughout the country. That will be the last week in June. Next slide. And want you to mark your calendars for our upcoming events. The September quarterly breakfast will include the content that we were supposed to present in May. This is around the Einstein Medical College and the commercialization efforts that are going on up there, together with the development that's being done by Simone Healthcare Development. And there's really a life science renaissance going on in the Bronx right now, which we want everybody to know about. And then we will be hosting another quarterly reception at the end of September. And we are moving our Life Science Real Estate Development Symposium from June 17th to October 23rd. It will still be held at the New York Academy of Sciences if we can hold it there. And if not, we will be examining and looking at virtual alternatives. Next slide. So now I would love to introduce Simone Fishberg, who is the Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of BioCentury. And she will be speaking on the business and financial impact of COVID-19 on the life sciences industry.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Nancy. Thank you for inviting me. BioCentury is absolutely delighted to participate in this and support it. Let's go to the next slide. I want to say that, you know, I am here on the West Coast in the area you talk about, San Francisco Bay Area. We, you know, obviously do events in New York. We have been following the tough time in New York. We've been covering this at BioCentury, and certainly, you know, looking at what's going on with this disease all over the country, and how New York has come together is truly inspirational. For those of you not familiar with BioCentury, we are leading intelligence platform for the biopharmaceutical industry. We have a stream of content online, we have data, we have increasingly ourselves, pushed by COVID-19, been doing webinars and podcasts. You can get these actually on our website and Spotify and Google and so on. Let's go to the next slide. I want to start by just sort of giving you what I'm going to tell you. We've been following COVID-19, in fact, since it was an outbreak in China. Our first story on this was, I think, January the 21st. It was pretty clear to us that this was going to be a very big deal. And I think that there's three things that I want to convey today. One is that the biopharma industry has jumped in to solve COVID-19 like never before. There are collaborations among farmers, there is activity, there is momentum. Like, I think those of us who've been in the industry and watching the industry just haven't seen anything like this, and people have talked about this as a moment sort of similar to World War II, to the sort of industries coming together. This has been a tough few months on the markets. There was a particularly grim time, or let's call it a nervous time, in March and April. The financial fallout was unclear. As we're coming to the end of May, the biopharma industry at least is in, I don't want to call it a protected space, but it has actually a fairly positive outlook. And I'll go through some of this. Many IPOs, follow-ons, and newcos. Lots of deals being signed. There is a lot of activity. We have all, as we have right now with virtual meetings, I think that those of us on the West Coast should also be allowed to start at 3 p.m. drinking whatever it is you're drinking on the East Coast. You know, in some ways we're delighted to follow your East Coast time zone. But we've all pivoted to this, and I think our industry is also pivoting. So let's go to the next slide. I want to tell you that we created a COVID-19 resource center. This is all in front of the paywall. You can access, we have more than 450, well, I'll talk about this in the next few slides. We have compounds in development, we have readouts on clinical trials, we are launching an interactive dashboard of those. There are actually, we've updated this is a little, one day out of date. There's a diagnostics tracker. There's a tremendous amount of information in addition to all our written coverage and our podcasts, which are all in front of the paywall on COVID-19. So I invite you, if you're not subscriber, to enjoy that, and then to think about the fact that you would get this all year round, and to subscribe, of course, as well. So let's go to the next slide. You know, I talked about the industry jumping in. There are more than 450 compounds in development. These are being tracked by BioCentury. People actually submit them to us. So if you know of compounds, go to the website. We decided to do this early on. This actually goes back to before April the 13th. I thought it would tailor off. I thought it would tailor off even by maybe the end of April. It continues to rise every week. These are therapies, they're vaccines, they're clinical, they're preclinical. Let's go to the next slide. And really, for an industry that actually has had its troubles in terms of the public, and I've been writing about this in a commentary today, biopharma is really showing the world its best side. I mean, this is a detailed diagram, and it's actually only one aspect of the biology. And I think it just gives you a sense of the number of companies that are jumping in, attacking it in different ways. You have consortia coming together to make sure that they're not all overlapping, that different people are testing different mechanisms and in different patient populations. So it's actually you know, I wish, and I'm actually calling on the industry always to operate like this, but it is really heartening to see this amount of activity coming together. Let's go to the next slide. We did a survey together with Sanford Bernstein, and this was it ran from April 14th to 17th. And as I said, this was a sort of quite a bit of a winter in the middle of you know, this sort of year from January until now. And the markets went down, and these were biotechs. Almost all of these were small biotechs, either less than $500 million market cap or had raised less than $75 million in venture money at the time. And most of them were expecting financing delays. Many of them were expecting lower valuations or that they'd be able to raise less. Only 10% thought that COVID-19 would not affect their financing. Next slide. I want to let you know that this full survey is actually available via BioCentury. I'm only going to show you a small snapshot of it. Many of them were deferring or downgrading their IPO plans. You can see that 57% thought they would defer for a year or more. Another 19% thought that they would go ahead with a lower valuation. Let's go next slide. And companies have been planning how to manage their cash with obviously reducing travel spend, program spend, some of them on consultants, senior management salaries. Let's go on. Companies have been behaving, next slide, sorry, you know, responsibly through this, and they are looking beyond equity sales. So a minority actually are interested in selling assets, but many of them are looking to out-license assets. About 40% are tapping government loans. Several of them are raising debt. And equally importantly, they are flexible on partnering terms. As we entered this year, it was pretty much a seller's market. That flipped with COVID. It's changed a little bit, but there's a lot of deals to be done. Let's go to the next slide. That people are seeking different investor types. You can see public companies here, as you know, are actually going to private. So we're going to see pipes and vipes. They're going to private investors. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see people are looking internationally for new investors as well. US, Europe, China, and other areas. And the next slide, please. But now I want to sort of start showing you that that was a survey of what people expected. Now I'm going to show you what the numbers actually show. And actually, life science IPOs on NASDAQ have not yet declined. The number went up in 2020 from January to April over 2019. Sorry, not the number, the amount. The amount raised. The number went slightly down, but you know, it's not a huge amount. I think it's 11 to 10 or 12 to 11. Let's go to the next slide. Follow-on financings. Here, this is by week since the beginning of the year. And you can see this period from the 21st of February, sort of through the big early April, even the middle of April. And this is the area when our survey was conducted, when there was a little bit of a winter there, and you know, follow-on financings are on the rebound, the last few weeks show. And if we go to the next slide, you will see this is actually ones that were completed on May the 18th. Actually, I do lose track of the date. I think that's this week. But we had a bumper day of I think 8 follow-ons on one day. And what you'll see in particular where there's a catalyst, the discounts are lower. So you've got Moderna Inc. there, which obviously is a COVID-19 related catalyst, but many of these are nothing to do with COVID. You've got BCMA deal, you've got stem cell therapy deals, you've got you know, various other things in cancer going on. And so follow-ons are actually, you know, people are raising money. Let's go to the next slide. The last ones I talked about were the public markets. Privates are also raising money. Life science funds, and I've been interviewing a lot of executives in pharmas and also VCs. So since the start of the year, in fact, since we looked at this, because I think another one has closed since then, over $11 billion has been raised in private venture, and they all have to spend that money. When you're early in a fund cycle, you got to spend the money. So these people are looking for deals. And we have several here that are above $1 billion new funds. Let's go to the next slide. You can actually see that they are spending those funds. So if you look at the Series A financing rounds, in the first quarter, you'll see it's the same number as in the range of the last few quarters. And the amount raised is $1.24 billion. Now, I think it's also fair to say that many of these IPOs and many of these financings were started before COVID. Several of them were actually completed during COVID. And I actually, I in fact did an interview with James Sabry from Roche and Mike Gilman from Arrakis, who closed a fairly substantial deal. And, they talked about closing it during COVID, but there's a lot of activity still going on. And, we've listed here the most active life science VCs. I know they all like to jockey with one another, so I thought it would be fun to put this up, and I'm sure that will be there. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to wrap in a minute. There's really healthy optimism in biopharma. We have actually a fresh new face at the head of the industry organization, Bio, Michelle McMurray-Heath, who gave us a quote. She on a podcast interview said, "This is the current crisis we face with COVID is a perfect example of how science is the promise of the future." James Sabry from Roche, this was one of the biggest deals that company has done for such an early stage company. And we have Les from E Squared Capital telling us they're still writing checks on the private side. So my final slide, my summary slide, sorry, is the solution to COVID-19 is going to come from large and small biotechs who are literally working around the clock and around the globe to create countermeasures. COVID-19 has affected small biotechs financially as the market slumped, and they do have a need to conserve cash. The good news is that VCs and farmers have plenty of money to deploy, and they are very keen to do deals with good, innovative companies. So if you just go to the next one, I think I just want to, this is a free resource, as I mentioned, where you will find BioCentury's coverage and all of this information at more depth. And I think the next slide is just a contact slide. These are my colleagues. Nancy, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. That was great information. And I think we're seeing the similar trends in New York, although I have to say that several companies closed fairly large follow-on financing here in New York City, even in the midst of the COVID crisis in March. And we had a number of companies conduct IPOs in the first quarter. All of that is covered in our quarterly newsletter, and there's news coverage on that on our website. So we've been seeing that here in New York, and just today I saw several smaller companies that are currently at the incubators. Biolabs at NYU, for example, announced their Series A financing, and so companies are closing on the money. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how VCs are actually going to evaluate deals now when they can't meet founders in person, because this personal connection is so important in their investment decision, and establishing that relationship over an extended period of time is also important. How are VCs going to invest when they have to evaluate everything virtually?
So that's a great point, Nancy. And I've been talking to a bunch of VCs, both in New York, in Boston, and actually even internationally. The truth is that the problem is not actually conducting the evaluation, but meeting people in the first place. And so this is actually where the entrenched networks will have a little bit of an advantage, and finding people who know VCs will help you. The VCs are on Zoom all day long. Actually, Mike Gilman, one of the interesting things he said when they closed that deal with Roche was that they had actually planned on a three-day visit from Roche to them in Boston to go through all the final details and negotiate it all. They did it all over Zoom, and it took them a day and a half. And he said, had we had 3 days, we'd have taken 3 days. But frankly, we did it in a day and a half. So due diligence is being done. Conducting deals, completing them, finalizing them over Zoom is being done. Accessing the, VCs when you can't go to meetings is harder. And so events like this or finding ways to communicate and connect with VCs is the new hurdle, and that's where we're going to learn how virtual events and how organizations like yours can actually contribute to that dynamic.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. So now I would love to introduce John McComber, who's a senior lecturer in finance at the Harvard Business School, and he is going to be talking about healthy building strategies for returning to work.
Great, thanks. So Nancy, thank you for inviting me, and Simone, thank you for terrific information. And of course, the ultimate solution to the COVID issue, we hope, is through a vaccine or a treatment or something. So I hope all those protocols work out just like you're describing. I'm going to talk about something a little more prosaic, which is how do we get back into our buildings? Because in the meantime, we have to work on these things going forward. So can we go to the next slide, please? I'm basically a real estate and construction guy. I spent 30 years in that industry before selling those businesses and coming to Harvard Business School to teach real estate. And I partnered up with Professor Joseph Allen from the Harvard School of Public Health, who's an infectious disease specialist, to write this book, Healthy Buildings, which came out last month. We didn't know, of course, that this horrible scourge was going to come upon the planet. We were really writing about the next generation of buildings moving from green buildings, which we think about the building more than they think about the humans, into healthy buildings, which go beyond saving a few pennies on energy into saving a lot dollars on health and on productivity and on actually improved cognition, which we can show in double-blind trials. So now with the advent of COVID, the question becomes, how do we get back to work? And there's all this talk in politics about the grand opening up. What I want to do is give you 3 frameworks to use as you think about coming to businesses, partly from the point of view of a landlord, partly from the view of the property manager for a tenant company, partly from the view of a bank or an insurance company, and partly from the view of an individual person saying, am I actually comfortable leaving my young children and my aging parents and riding on the subway to go to work? So next slide, please. A lot of the foundation of the book is around the foundation. I guess a lot of the essence is around the 9 foundations of a healthy building, which has been demonstrated over about 40 years of research at the Harvard School of Public Health. And they're the ones that would seem obvious to you and particularly obvious to lab type clients. So I'm sort of already speaking to the choir here in terms of air quality and ventilation, particularly in wet labs, but also thermal health, dust and pests, safety and security. We think it's going to be more and more of a concern for people, as well as water quality. You saw in the New York Times today the concern that if buildings have been shut down for 2 months, there could be Legionella and other things in the pipes, and noise and lighting. So these are the kind of things that Joe and I pursue. And I look at it as a real estate person in terms of thinking, if the base building has the capacity to use this stuff, will the tenants need it? Will the tenants pay me a premium to do this? And we have the virtual tour in half an hour. I think we'll see some of that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to leave you with 2 frameworks about going back. One is about this layered approach or hierarchy of controls, essentially, to try and minimize risk. There's no way that it's going to be totally safe in the workplace. And those of you who are infectious disease specialists have seen this before. But at the bottom of this pyramid is the most effective way to minimize risk of COVID, which is to stay home, to eliminate exposures. Unfortunately, that's also really expensive in terms of disruption to business. Next up in the hierarchy, less wide because it's not as effective, but higher up because it's also less expensive, is substitution of activities, which in our current context means essential workers, partly lab workers, but also grocery store workers and bus drivers. Next up, is less effective, but also less expensive, are a number of engineering controls, which I'll talk about around the building. This is the sweet spot for what I do around healthy buildings. Next up is administrative controls, and you'll hear a lot about these going forward. Administrative controls are things like staggering when people come to work, which I think you talked about last week when you heard from all the the construction companies and engineers about some of the work that was done. So if you have 100 people in a lab, if they're working 30% of them 9 to 5, 30% of them 5 to noon to midnight, and 30% of them midnight to morning, then you have the same work done in the same space, but you have social distancing accomplished. That's an administrative control. And at the top of the pyramid, which is actually the least effective, but also the least disruptive to business, is personal protective equipment. And when you go back to work, you are for sure going to have a mask. You're probably going to have some shield that you got from somewhere, and all the wipes that you can find that weren't sold out yet at CVS and Walgreens. Well, that's a Boston thing. You're from New York, so it's Duane Reade. But that's where those things would be. So there's all kind of things to layer here. There's not just one thing to do. With respect to engineering controls, these are things notably around ventilation and filtration. So it's not the time for the property manager to save 3 cents on electricity because you only have a MERV 8 filter. They should go to MERV 12 or a HEPA filter, which a lot of your labs already have. It's really short money to be saving by trying to stretch filters when you really now have not just a few sick days at hand, but really human life. The next thing I wanted to talk about is health performance indicators. So Joellen and I have proposed these as ways to objectively measure how healthy is the building. And some of these are leading indicators like what's the design fan speed, leading indicators like how many people per office. Some are lagging indicators like what is the level of particulates in the space, or are people actually happy? Are they comfortable? So we propose that there are objective ways to measure things in the building ahead of time and also after the fact, and with the human beings. Because in the end, we don't care about healthy buildings, we care about healthy people. So what are you trying to do? In particular, who is going to assure you that your space is safe to work in? In some of the places that I hang out with other real estate people and lawyers, you can just imagine the backlog of liability issues and concerns about coming back to work and whose fault is this, and is there business interruption, is it force majeure, all that. So are you going to listen to the landlord, is it safe to come back? Probably in the next presentation we hear, or your office manager or some health inspector. They're not going to show up. Will the bank and the insurance company be comfortable having people in the space, or will you yourself have to measure? We think a lot of this will be you yourself measuring. So there's a lot of talk about opening up, but opening up is really a supply side thing. It means there's more supply of offices or restaurants or stores you can go to, but what about the demand side? Meaning, yes, the office can be open, the restaurant can be open, the store can be open, but if nobody goes, nobody's comfortable, then that's only half the equation. So actually, I'm flipping ahead on my slides, not on yours. So can you flip forward? Let's see. I was describing the health performance indicators because I thought I was writing the slides. 2 more to where the green arrow is. Thank you. So I'm sorry, I've been teaching on Zoom with all my MBA students, and I kind of get used to running my own screen share. So the health performance indicators are objective measures like pulse or blood pressure. You can say, yes, here's what it is. For example, particulates, like what are the level of PM 2.5s in the space, like carbon dioxide parts per million. And Joe's double-blind referee journal research shows that cognition is really affected by the amount of CO2 in the room, which you know instinctively because you get sleepy in a poorly ventilated conference room, poorly vented airplane. Filter change records, that's an objective way to look at what's happened in the building, and you could imagine asking the landlord or the property manager for that. Then you get into some of the more human issues like the behavior of your coworker. Are you comfortable if your coworker is there coughing and sneezing, not wearing a mask? Probably not. There's ways to think about this. There's surveys you can be looking at. Look at trends in your own moods and how you're thinking about, is this a safe place for teams to be where I want to be able to work? It goes beyond just the physical piece of was I isolated in the elevator and into what else is going on. And finally, the lagging indicators for businesses will be how many sick days are there now that people have gone back? What will be the health claim coverages? So if there's an opening up and people go back to work and then they get COVID-19, is there going to be a pointing match about they got it from their kids, or they got it on the subway, they got it in their office? So those would be lagging indicators, obviously 2 weeks to a month behind these opening things. So to summarize, the 9 foundations of a healthy building are all of what you need to be thinking about as a landlord, tenant, or worker. The hierarchy of controls is a way to think about when to go back, starting with the baseline of separation and ending with the least expensive, which is personal protective equipment. And health performance indicators can measure the performance of the building and also the performance of the people, so you can be comfortable asking people to come back to work.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. How are employers actually broaching these kinds of questions with their landlords or these issues with their landlords and asking for these kinds of changes as they think about bringing employees back to work?
Well, if I was running the classroom and I was a moderator like you are, I would ask people to write in the chat window what they're doing, what their position. Don't do it until Nancy suggests it, because it's all over the map, and you actually have an interesting subset of people right here. For the most part, we're finding that the facility managers are taking it on themselves. Like, their landlord may say yes, it's safe to come back, and the facility manager says maybe not. This is really different in your world, where you're talking about people who are accustomed to super clean environments already. It's a lot different for some small tax preparation firm in some mom and pop 20,000 square foot building out in Nebraska, where there hasn't really been that much of an impact on COVID, and where they're worried about the economic impact of not collecting rents. So we haven't talked about it at all in this meeting, but every other call you're on with real estate people talk about how people paid some of the rent in March, none of the rent in April, and May is going to be worse. So there's much more pressure. It's not clear that companies who are struggling to survive and landlords who are struggling to make the mortgage are going to spend extra money making sure the filtration is right, or maybe they'll just claim that they did it.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. If people have suggestions about what they're doing, please feel free to put them into the chat room, and we can talk about them. Because all of these issues are obviously going to be front and center as different areas of the country start opening up, and as people start, thinking about going back to work. I've got one comment here. As architects, we are offering a comprehensive back to work planning together with facility managers. So that's one.
So what I would be thinking about if I was an architecture firm would be adopting some of these health performance indicators and saying, we can go out and measure particulates for you. We can go out and measure whether the fans have actually been changed. We can even survey your employees once a week to see how comfortable they are as part of our architectural service, to do more than just suggest some things we can do with the furniture and with the fittings. And Nancy, I think you're having a session next week with architects and interiors people about this issue, aren't you?
Absolutely. We'll have safety engineers, architects, interior designers, and others who are grappling with these issues right now. And it's really interesting because the issues are, just what you talked about, but they're also about privacy, for example. How much can employers monitor employees, and how does that information get used? And if an employee gets sick, there's no obligation to inform an employer, and that information is protected by HIPAA. So there's numerous bureaucratic issues that overlap here, and it's not clear how they're all going to get worked out. But yes, we will be talking about a lot of those issues next week in the SGA sponsored seminar. So thank you, John. Love to move on to Natalie McVeigh, Director of Eisner-Amper, who's going to talk about the psychology of the new work environment and dealing with employees.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nancy, and the previous two presenters. This is a great session so far. I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of dealing with this time. We're going to talk a little bit about COVID in general, but also about how to maintain culture. And John made some great points about, the building supporting people. We work with organizations and for organizations, but firstly, we work for and with people. And that's one of the pieces that we're talking about. And what makes people effective during this time is feeling like they're belonging as a part of a community. We know from neuroscience that our desire to belong outweighs our desire for safety. That's part of this urge to get back in these buildings. We want to feel like we're a part of something, and we may not be doing it as safely as possible. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies to maintain team belonging while virtual, as well as how we might be able to do this in the future as we come together. So next slide, please. I wanted to give you a few work from home statistics, but not based on working from home pre-COVID. These are actual current status about surveys during COVID. So one of the first surveys from the INSEAD group says that 40% of people are indicating there's a productivity improvement right now. 37% there's no difference, and 23 note a decline in productivity. Now, interestingly enough, there's kind of two phases that are happening right now. There's partly a honeymoon phase where, you know, we've adjusted to this, we understand that it's working, and we're thinking about ways we're gonna bring things into the workforce in the future. I wouldn't get too sold on that yet because we haven't gone through it. And then there's another phase that's happening that's called the third quarter phase that's been studied by astronauts and submariners, where we've been in isolation so long that there's some angst and oversensitivity at this moment. So it's interesting to have those two pieces of time being shown right now. And then a Korn Ferry study said that the biggest obstacle for working from home is loneliness, and how we combat loneliness and keep it as just isolation is really finding belonging, having people believe in something greater than themselves. And there's another study talking about how family relationships right now are being more negatively impacted than positively impacted. However, we're finding that people, when they start to articulate that they might be going back to the office, are realizing they may miss their family as much as it's a distraction. This INSEAD study also said that most of the things that are failing right now aren't the technology. That was really the focus at the beginning, is let's get the technology right. Well, overall, the technology is working. The question is, how do we stay collaborative? Because in the past 10 years, time in collaboration has made for business efficacy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that now in, you know, I hate this phrase already, but in this new normal. So if we can go to the next slide. So I want to just briefly talk about our brain. This is explaining some of what's going on. There are a bunch of chemicals in our brain, but the two strongest chemicals are oxytocin and cortisol. Oxytocin is the strongest chemical. It's the bonding hormone. It's us feeling like we belong. It comes from saying things like we, from being open, from being trusting, from being appreciative, from being inclusive. It is not the easiest to get outside of contact. It's commonly called the cuddle hormone as well. Now, the second strongest chemical in our brain is cortisol. It is the stress hormone. It's when we feel unsafe, when we distrust people. And you can see the arrows on this brain diagram. They literally live in different zip codes. So when one's going off, it shuts the other one down. Cortisol has what we call, it's a very technical term, we call it a cortisol hangover. It's not really that technical, but when cortisol shows up, it has a 26-hour shelf life. So think about that. So each day if we wake up worrying about what's going on, it's hijacking our ability to use our executive functioning. So one of the things we want to really do is we want to be the emotional contagion as leaders, as individuals, to help alleviate people's stressors, to bring down their cortisol interactions through how we interact with them. And we can do this verbally. The part of neuroscience that I'm a practitioner in is specifically around conversational intelligence and how we can affect people's neurochemistry by how we speak to them and how we communicate with them, even in a virtual world. Now, it's slightly harder in a virtual world because in person, if I'm just 10 feet close to you, there's something called enthalpy in which my neurobiology will mix with yours. But now, how do we do that virtually just by the words we say? So we can go to the next slide. So physical and psychological safety matter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what John was mentioning earlier. The physical space of the building does matter. Now, this goes for both individuals at their home right now or potential new buildings. Adding plants to a home or office makes a huge difference. In fact, they find that having either windows or plants improves attention, blood pressure, productivity and allows people to be more generous towards one another. Creating circles and other fun shapes allow people to be more creative and more collaborative. And then the fact if you actually move it around, if you're at home, because that's one of the things that's happening is we're suffering from exhaustion right now because everything is the same. You get a little bit of a dopamine hit. I wouldn't move too many things around right before bed because someone will stub their toe or something like that. And then you want to surround yourself with bright colors. Studies show that bright colors make people more confident, friendly, interested, more alert. And it's one of those things that might be really helpful. And then really keep it a little more clean, a little more productive. There are kind of two brain waves. There's our beta brain waves that are the things we're thinking about most pressing. And then there's our theta brain waves that think about things that don't make sense, and they're trying to organize the world. So it helps us be a little more clear. And then as a leaders, how we can help our team members feel more safe is to ask questions. 6% of ensuing conversations we spend in questions, but it creates 60% of conversation after. It also raises your emotional intelligence. It also stops people from having that defense mechanism at first. They actually lower their shoulders and they have more limbic response versus a cortisol response. Foster openness and curiosity. This is the time where we get to think together. We get to co-create. Allow and encourage mistakes. There's a lot of research on anti-fragility. So when you actually make mistakes and come through them, we'll be stronger together. And find opportunities for depth in the connection and learning right now. That's another antidote to loneliness, is finding depth versus breadth. Even before COVID, they did some studies that showed the depth of our communication with one another really helped people feel connected. And so we're seeing right now there's a lot of quantity of communication. I don't know about you, but it's Zoom meeting inundation from different groups in different ways, and you know, we go really quickly and we give people time back, and it's just the splattering, but people are missing that depth, those moments where there's a little bit more connection. And then facilitate action. There's a belief in the United States specifically that how we get motivated is by having inspiration, and it comes. But this research shows that if you can actually start the action, the motivation and inspiration will follow. So find ways to instigate with your teams, some action that they can feel successful for. And then if they can highlight that successful at the end of the day, they will also be more creative. There was a study done at Harvard that talked about just one thing that you've done during the day, being able to highlight it by the end of the day allows you to be happier and productive in your ensuing activities. We can go to the next slide. These are the types of communication we're seeing right now. There's high bandwidth communication. High bandwidth communication is really in person. It's the most connected, it's the most accessible, it's the most interesting. It's the one in which communication actually happens. You all have probably heard that study that says, you know, 93% of communication is nonverbal, 55% is body language, and 38% is tone of body. Tone and voice. So your tone and voice can still be done virtually. Some body language can be, but not exactly the same. And face-to-face requests are 34% more effective than other requests, but we can't have that all the time. Some of your essential services are, but what we're now doing is low bandwidth communication, which really misses that 55% of the body language in many cases. Because even though you're seeing some body language from me, it's just from here up. It's not very effective. And then there's two modes of communication. One is synchronous and one is asynchronous. We've been seeing in the research that asynchronous communication can be effective, but how and when we use it is really, really useful. It's impossible to have communication all the time together, and having teams feel good about that. And then there's scheduled and unscheduled. Scheduled is great in some ways, but what teams often do is they hold back on things they have to say because I know I'm going to see you next Monday. So find ways to sporadically jump in with your teams whenever possible. We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to highlight all of these in great detail. You're going to get the slides and you can all read, but I do want to pick up on a couple of these for having virtual communication, because it's what we do is we don't want to lose those informal communication mechanisms. Find ways to create the same space, the informality that exists, and don't over-invite. Virtual meetings, even before COVID, were consistently rated as the least effective mechanism for meeting, the least engaging, and consistently rated that. So the quality of your meetings is directly related to the number of people on them. And then don't overly schedule the agenda. You want to set the agenda in advance so people are prepared, but really get to where we can start talking as though we do naturally. We're finding out that pauses on video create the opposite effect as they do in person. In person, we find them intimate. You know, we have silence with people we care about. On video, it's causing us angst. Also, a weird tip is if you actually do your video to the side, like if we did it this way, it looks weird for everyone else, but it actually feels like for me that I'm in a room, like I would be sitting next to someone else. And it causes me to feel less like I'm being watched and under a microscope. And then don't give time back. We don't want it to seem like it's a burden for your employees. We'll skip to the next slide. And one of the most important things is acknowledging people's feelings and emotions. Anxiety is rising for everyone right now, and they've done some research that says emotionally intelligent organizations are the litmus test for organizational health. So sharing your own stories, your own anecdotes, partly the brain peaks with that. The moment you start talking about something personal, it's interesting to someone else. We resonate, we feel as though we're connecting and we're belonging. And the one-on-ones are very, very important in this time frame. They work equally well for introverts and extroverts. A lot of people think extroverts need a quantity of people, and in times outside of the physical distancing, they do. But during this time, the point is learning from, being interested in what people are saying. So I'll stop there. There is one slide after that I wasn't going to speak to, but you guys will get, that's really helpful. If we could slip to that slide real quick, that'd be useful. This is how these modes of communication we've been using for years might need to change during this time of physical distancing, because they're not the same as they used to be anymore. It's one thing to shoot off a quick email to Joe and then see him in the hallway later to clarify. So this is a resource for you all to have as we go about with this. Nancy, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, one of the hazards of video, right? Thank you very much. I think that one of the big challenges, especially for life sciences, is the informal nature of work. You know, first of all, you're working in teams all the time, working very closely in the lab. Your facilities are laid out, and the layout of the facility really was driving the culture here. You know, open areas where people can bump into each other, open luncheon spaces, walls where people can stop and write on and, you know, sit together and iron out a problem. You know, all of those kinds of creative work that is going to be very difficult to, you know, happen in a more structured environment. And it's very, very important for creativity and discovery in life sciences.
Yeah, and that's part of that asynchronous communication piece that they've been finding is much more beneficial. And what we're trying to do is we're doing so many Zooms and so many virtual meetings that it might not be allowing for that creativity. And we might not be using this mechanism as useful as we could. There are much ways to annotate on Zoom. There are ways that you can kind of simulate what would happen in real time, but being very careful about those 6 types of communication: high bandwidth, low bandwidth, synchronous, asynchronous, when to use them, how to use them. And it's really about the objective that brings that in there. There is a lot we are losing in many ways because our habit has been disruptive, and habit is a psychological anchor for us. But to bring that intentionality for new behaviors actually increases an optionality that we didn't have before, because some of our habitual behavior also creates us to be a little bit more narrow-minded too. So I do think it's a challenge, but there is this opportunity that had the world continued in the way it was, we might not have been able to rethink some of our approaches.
Yeah, so there's also an opportunity here as well. So John, there's a few people that actually jumped on the chat here. So Silky Rapilius basically said they're partnering with signage companies, furniture vendors, and healthcare consultants as architects. Triumvirate offers a back-to-work program utilizing employee health and safety leading practices, so somewhat like what your framework laid out. And from Silky Rapilius again, we are mostly de-densifying workspaces, showing possibilities how to reduce occupancy in conference rooms and pantries safely. We're helping to add partition screens and sneeze guards. And all of these are, again, you know, they're kind of barriers to the virus, but they're also barriers for us to interacting with each other in a communicative and creative way, which makes this very challenging.
It'll be another add-on for Natalie to say, how do we communicate, how do we act in person when we're all wearing masks and we lose all that other signaling and there's plastic in between us?
Exactly. And we have Tina Masika, I'm sorry if I'm garbling your last name, wrote my thesis in 1993 in search of healthy buildings. Well, you don't have to search anymore because John and his colleague are going to be creating them. Excellent presentation by all. So if there's no more questions or comments, do any of you have any closing comments you'd like to make here? Well, great presentation. Thank you very much, all of you, for participating tonight. And feel free to stay on and, you know, meet some of our members in the smaller group meetings at the end, if you like. And now we'll introduce Bill Harvey, who is going to, from Newmark Knight Frank, who's going to give us a virtual tour of InnoLabs. Bill?
Thanks very much, Nancy. And thank you, Mitch, too, for having me present this. It's great to reconnect with both of you. And I very much appreciate the opportunity. So about 15 months ago, Newmark Knight Frank was hired as the leasing agent for InnoLabs, the 267,000 square foot purpose-built life science project now under construction in Long Island City. We take just kind of a quick step back and just talk a little bit about King Street. King Street is actually the largest private landlord of lab space in the Boston-Cambridge market. They own and operate about 2.5 million square feet of space, all laboratory space. This is actually their first project outside of the Boston-Cambridge area. King Street is very bullish on New York City generally, and on Long Island City in particularly. This is a rendering of the building. We are somewhat slowed down by COVID-19. Our project broke ground in September, October of last year, under construction for a good 6 months, and then everything was halted on March 27th. At the time, we thought that we were probably about a year away from delivery. Our construction moratorium, if you will, lasted only about 3 weeks. So our construction team is they've been back on site for close to a month now. And we expect the building to deliver probably in April or May, mid-April, late May of next year. It's interesting, given that time frame for base building delivery, we also have the ability to begin tenant construction later this year. So I was on a call prior to this with a potential tenant, and the timing on this, I think, is very good. We put together a virtual tour since we've been shut down for more than 2 months now. And we kind of strategically decided that we weren't going to reach out to new tenants during the month of April, just because it looked kind of bad. But we did use this to reach out to some of the tenants that we had already talked to. In the last 3 weeks, we've had a number of new meetings, virtual meetings, of course. And the response that we've gotten on it has been actually really, really positive. So I'm just going to walk you through it quickly, just to give you kind of a sense of where the building is. I don't know how familiar many of you are with Long Island City. What usually does it for most people, though, is actually our proximity to One Court Square. One Court Square is the tallest building in Long Island City. More recently, it was known as Amazon's kind of future home. That was until Valentine's Day of last year. We think that for all the same reasons that Amazon, which had its pick over, I think 300 different jurisdictions, sought to host Amazon for the HQ2. We think that the ingredients that made Long Island City work so well for Amazon also work very well for life science. The 4 trains that you see here, the GE, M, and 7, the entrance to the Court Square subway station is about 50 yards from our front door. We think that transportation, the amenities that we have, the abundance of workforce housing. We have a beautiful park, actually, that you can kind of see right across the street from our building. We think that all of these factors really kind of create a nice sense of destination that is going to be very attractive to companies as they try and attract and retain key employees. I should say key employees that happen to skew very young, very sophisticated, and very well educated. So just go inside. Oops, excuse me. So, Nancy was just talking before about the, the nature of life science is very collaborative. We all talk about Kendall Square and, the collisions, the positive collisions that kind of exist on Main Street in Kendall Square and in other places. So the cafes, the restaurants, the bars, the gyms, all these things really matter. It was very important to King Street from the start of this project to really create some nice amenity space. And I think that you'll agree that this is really nice space. So we've got about 15,000 square feet of space between the lobby and the auditorium here that you'll see. We'll just go in for a second. We have about a 185 person capacity auditorium. The auditorium can actually be split in 2, so you can have actually 2 events at the same time. But the heart of what we're talking about here is what I call the living room. And this is the really kind of the informal, casual breakout area that we think is going to be very, very popular with the building's tenants. This is actually my favorite view here. You get a nice sense of the auditorium, some couches. This is all the amenity space out front, the living room, if you will. There's obviously no charge for this. This is where we envision people just getting together for informal collaboration. We're actually talking to a catering company right now. The catering company is a local Long Island City, a very, very high-end catering company. They're going to run our cafe. They'll have, breakfast, coffee, high-end coffee, pastries in the morning, soup, salad, sandwiches, kind of a grab-and-go menu at lunchtime. They will have, everyone asks this, they will have a liquor license as well. The catering company will be available to do events. I talked before about King Street and the importance of this building being not only the physical center of life science in New York City, but also the spiritual center too. So there's lots of ideas on how to program the space, and symposiums. We're going to talk to Nancy about future New York Builds Bio events. But I think that the response that we've gotten so far on the amenity space has been really nice. The one other thing that I'll kind of show you, it's actually on the second floor, but you can see it here a little bit. We have a double high ceiling carved in the front of the building to kind of enhance light coming into the space. But you'll see too that this is enclosed by glass. So this has the potential to be really, really great space for the right tenant. Just going to go upstairs to kind of a demonstration floor. I'm just going to pause here to see if anyone has any questions, Nancy. If not, I can proceed. Oops.
I don't see anything that's come up on the chat. And I think, you're kind of demonstrating visually in the space what we've all been talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, if there's time later, we can talk about how coronavirus kind of overlays this. But there's no hard and fast rules, but I definitely have some thoughts on this. And we've spoken with the developer, obviously, and the equity investor, and if you'd like, we can certainly have that conversation as well. This gives you a great sense of not only the aesthetics when you look out at the window, but just the proximity to Manhattan. This long white shed here is actually the 7 train. So this is 3 stops away from Grand Central. And, I could do it in about 8 minutes if all goes well. I should also say, just going back to transportation, Court Square is very unique in that you have a 1-seat commute to all of the city's 3 main transportation hubs. So you can hit Grand Central, obviously, on the 7 train. You can hit the Port Authority on the E train or the 7 train, and then Penn Station, obviously, on the E train as well. So Penn Station is about 18 minutes away. The Port Authority is about 12 minutes away, and then Grand Central 10 or so is what we're saying. And I think that's important too, because I think as New Yorkers, we don't really think about distance in terms of mileage as much as we think about time and convenience. And so, even though, yes, we are ostensibly an outer borough, from a location perspective, it's almost unbeatable. I think it's only Lower Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, and the Times Square neighborhoods that are better served by public transportation than well-located Long Island City. This is just kind of a...
Bill, is this space pre-built, or is it built to suit?
It's not. This is just a rendering. So this is just to kind of indicate what can be done. We are talking about pre-building space for perhaps a small piece of this that can be. I can address that in greater depth if you'd like. Building to suit for certain tenants is also on the table. Our preference, I think, when the developer first started this, the idea would be, we would deliver a very robust base building infrastructure, and then with the rent, you would get a very healthy tenant improvement package. But we have the ability to build space in a couple of different ways.
Great.
Actually, the lab equipment is nice, but I think the picture that a lot of people really like is actually the without it. Just, it gives you kind of a sense of the floor. Really great column spacing. I neglected to mention, and this is a big piece, of the 267,000 square feet that will exist a year from now. only about 150,000 square feet exists currently. So the landlord is actually building, there's actually 3 different phases. So this piece where, if you can see where my cursor is, actually, you know what, I'm gonna jump pages here. This is kind of a typical test fit for a roughly 50-50 lab to office. But back to my earlier point, this is actually unbuilt right now. This piece over here is actually built only to the 2nd story. So this will be raised 4 stories. This piece also is unbuilt. This is going to be a big part of the core. So when you look at it, if you could kind of invert this, it'll look like a 6-story capital T. But of the 267,000 square feet, only roughly about 150 exist today. Once you're inside the new building, the only way that you'll know that you've kind of transitioned from the older building to the newer building is the windows on the newer building are a lot bigger. But this is, you know, this is one of these great Long Island City, you know, properties. They don't build buildings like this anymore, but it just kind of harkens back to the industrial heritage of Long Island City. It's in an M zone, which is, you know, certainly the best type of designation that you could be from a land use perspective, in that it gives you really the full array of options.
What's the TI for this project?
So well, I'll give you the whole kind of financial package. So we have proposals out on the space for about 75,000 square feet. In both proposals, our initial offer was $85 a square foot for rent, and I think we went out at $125 in terms of tenant improvement allowance. There's a little bit of give, obviously, on both ends. The rent can come down a little bit, the TI can go up. A big point to make too with this building, this was the kind of one of the flagship properties of the New York City Economic Development Corporation's LifeSci NYC program. So we have a full real estate tax abatement program that will you know, ultimately inure to the benefit of tenants. At an $80 rent, taxes are roughly 20%, so that's $16. That's $16 that tenants will not be paying that they otherwise would have been paying. So that's real savings, especially when you compare it to some of the other projects in the city that have a higher face rent and also have real estate taxes. Just yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Question. Did you allow for bigger exhaust shafts, high electricity loads, et cetera, required by wet labs?
We did. I mean, so this is designed as this is a Cambridge-like building. You know, again, we have the benefit of, or I should say, I have the benefit of working for a developer that has almost 2.5 million square feet, either owned or under management. They, you know, they know how to do this in their sleep. They have the recipe from their success up in Boston to do this. They've hired a gentleman named Ed Jerem with a real construction background to manage the overall process, but he's obviously very much focused on the construction piece of this right now.
Great.
Just a quick word about Long Island City. So our project is kind of right in the middle here. Alexandria has two sites just above the S in Sunnyside on my map. Let me see if I can drill down on this a little bit. But we're very, this is where the Alexandria sites are down here. If you can see where my cursor is. There's at least 2 other projects that are rumored to be considered for life science. And so, you know, if you aggregate the square footage of all these buildings, certainly the 2 Alexandria buildings total about 350,000 square feet, I believe. Ours is 267. that gets you to about 700,000 square feet, 600,000 square feet. The other two buildings are 270 and 200. So you're very close to 1 million square feet of space in Long Island City over the next 3 to 4 years, probably. So we really do see this as one of the key clusters for life science in New York City. And we're very happy to be at the middle of it all.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. That was really terrific.
Thank you.
I think everybody is really just wanting information and really wanting to know that projects are moving forward in the midst of all of this. And so to hear that, you're actively showing this and that it is moving ahead, and, you're looking to kind of have tenants thinking about moving in shortly is just terrific.
Yeah, it's a great testament actually to the work that you've done. I think that I've said this to you before, but I think that your fingerprints are all over the kind of built environment for life science in New York. So I think that you should take a bow on this too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Here's from Chris Horst from JBB. Well done, Bill. Happy to be a part of this amazing project.
Yeah, it's been great. There's a lot of people associated with the Genome Center project that are involved and even just kind of tangentially related to that. So it's a great group of people to work with.
Yeah, well, they all have all the experience of converting a building as complicated as the one we worked on at the New York Genome Center. So
absolutely,
stand you in good stead.
Yeah.
Great. Well, listen, we wanted to spend some time so that everybody could kind of interact with each other and talk to each other at the end of this meeting. So I'm going to ask the Berman group to basically randomly put us all into small groups so that we can talk to each other, and people can spend as much time as they like, sharing experiences. We will not shut the meeting down at 6:30 if people are still wanting to go on. So feel free. And you can also change rooms so that you can see people in other rooms as well.